A hashed consent cannot be signed for the silent humanity could have exposed the Cognizance Bureau in a single afternoon. Waited 6 years instead. That sentence sat at the top of the closing report. Commander Ellen Faraday would eventually file with the Solène Concorde Assembly, and every word of it was true, and none of it explained why the waiting had nearly broken her before it saved anyone at all. The Solène Concorde was 268 years old. The 19-member species sat beneath the high glass dome of the Halborn Rotunda in seats assigned by seniority, lie in a chamber where the furniture itself remembered who had arrived first and who had arrived last. Humanity had held a seat for 14 years, not a small amount of time by human accounting. A blink. By the Concords, the seating chart was not an accident. It was a decision dressed up as tradition. Humans held full voting rights on 6 of the Concorde's 40 standing subcommittees. Trade, transit, border survey, cultural exchange, 3 others, smaller, quieter, chosen for humanity the way a parent chooses which drawer a child is allowed to open. High. The Life Sciences Oversight Committee was not one of them. Humanity had asked twice in its first decade of membership to be added to that roster. Twice the answer had come back polite, documented and final. Insufficient case history, insufficient precedent, revisit in 20 years. The Concorde did not call this an insult. I called it prudence. New members made emotional decisions, the reasoning went, and matters of life science, genetics, biology, the delicate ethics of what one species owed another, required a settled temperament that only decades of institutional memory could produce. It was, on its surface, a defensible position. Humanity was young. Humanity had, in its own short history, made a great many decisions it later regretted. And the Concorde's elder species were not wrong that a species 11 years off its own homeworld's first faster-than-light engine could be reckless in ways it did not yet recognize in itself. The problem was not the reasoning. The problem was who the reasoning protected. The Cognizance Bureau answered to the Life Sciences Oversight Committee, a hand to almost no one else. It had existed for 190 years, quietly, competently, cataloguing biology across 19 species with the kind of thoroughness that made everyone comfortable enough to stop asking what exactly it was cataloguing for. Hide. Its reports were considered by every species old enough to remember its founding, the gold standard of Concorde institutional record-keeping. Its director sat one procedural tier below the Assembly's presiding council. Its budget had not been publicly audited in 31 years because no committee withstanding to request an audit had ever thought there was a reason to. Somewhere in an archive on the Concorde's oldest station sat a document called the Vitality Accord, signed by every member species at admission, including humanity, in its first year, when its delegation had been small and tired and grateful simply to have a seat at all. The Accord's language was old and dense and had been drafted generations before to cover exactly one contingency. What a member species owed the Concorde's collective survival during what it called an adaptive necessity event. A terraforming failure, a plague, a dying colony that needed a genetic solution faster than any lab could grow one. The Kai Accord called what it took from a species in that circumstance a voluntary biological contribution. No human delegate in 14 years had ever read past page 190 of that document. The document was 411 pages long. They should have. Ellen had seen the seating chart's true weight only once, directly, in her second year on the Concorde station, when a routine session of the Life Sciences Oversight Committee had drifted, briefly, into a discussion of accord renewal terms. As she had not been permitted to speak, non-voting observers were seated in a gallery one tier above the main floor, close enough to hear everything and far enough to matter to nothing. And she had watched a Concord elder from a species that had held its seat for over 2 centuries suggest how, without any particular malice, that younger member species should perhaps be walked through the Accord's finer provisions more slowly, in future decades, once their delegations had accumulated sufficient institutional patience to engage with them properly. Nobody in the room had disagreed. Nobody had needed to. The suggestion passed procedurally as a note for future consideration, and the session moved on to trade tariffs, and Ellen sat in the observer's gallery, with her hands folded in her lap, and understood, for the first time, with total clarity, that patience was not a virtue. The Concord was withholding from humanity out of caution. It was a virtue the Concord had learned, across 268 years, to require of everyone standing outside the circle of people the rules already protected. She did not know, sitting in that gallery, that she would spend the next 12 years of her career proving, deliberately and at great personal cost, that she could outwait an institution built by species who had been patient for centuries before humanity had learned to fly. The first human ambassador to the Concord, a tired diplomat named Osi, who had negotiated humanity's admission and had since retired to a quiet post teaching Concord procedural law, had said once, at a farewell dinner nobody important attended, that the price of a seat at any long-established table was always written in the fine print, and that the trouble with fine print was that it only ever hurt the people who hadn't needed to read it yet. He had said it as a joke. Nobody laughed. He had not meant it as one. Halden Reach sat on an ice moon at the edge of surveyed human space. 341 people running an atmospheric research station that nobody outside the settlement itself had heard of, and nobody inside it minded. It was cold and small, and by any Concord metric, unremarkable. Its only distinction, buried in a genomic survey filed with the Bureau 11 years earlier as a routine condition of settlement, was a population that had spent 3 generations adapting, through ordinary human resilience, not engineering, to sustained sub-zero exposure with a metabolic efficiency that on paper looked almost engineered. The Bureau called this a data point. It did not know that Halden Reach was also a town with a bakery that only opened on Sundays, and a school with 19 students, and a boy named Toma Ferris, who was 9 years old and had covered every wall of his bedroom with hand-drawn maps of planets that did not exist. Nobody at the Bureau ever learned Toma's name until it was far too late for the name to matter to him. That was, in its way, the entire point of the system Director Reel worked inside, a system built so that the people making the decision and the people living its consequences never had to occupy the same sentence. 3 transport vessels dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Halden Reach on an ordinary Tuesday. They flew under a Cognizance Bureau registry flag and a Vitality Accord authorization code that had been signed days earlier by a mid-level Concord administrator whose entire job was signing such codes, 6 systems away, without ever seeing the moon the code applied to. The colony had 6 hours' notice. The notice called what was coming a scheduled adaptive sampling visit. It did not use the word abduction because in Bureau paperwork the word did not exist. Director Cassia Reel did not travel to Halden Reach herself. She oversaw the operation from her office 11 light years away, the way she oversaw all 41 active sampling operations under her authority. through a status board that updated every 6 minutes and never once used a name. Halden Reach, population baseline 341, contribution target 80 individuals, ages 6 through 40, cold adaptation genomic profile. Her estimated processing window, 9 days. Real was not a cruel administrator. She wanted that understood. High. Though there was almost no one left by the end of this story who would still be willing to grant her the distinction. She had built her 40-year career on precision, not malice. She followed the Accord's language. Exactly. She required informed consent forms to be read aloud and in full to every contributing colonist before processing began. She required medical review at every stage. She required, and this detail would matter enormously later, a complete digital log of every procedure, every subject, every hour, because the Bureau's founding charter, older than Real herself, had been built on the conviction that thorough documentation was the same thing as ethical conduct. It was not. Overseer Malric Des commanded the enforcement escort for the Halden Reach operation, as he had for the 10 before it. He did not consider himself a soldier of conquest. He considered himself a logistics officer with a security portfolio. A higher distinction he had explained more than once to junior officers who asked uncomfortable questions after their first sampling deployment. There would always, he told them, be a species somewhere that mistook lawful procedure for hostility. It was not his job to make the procedure gentle. It was his job to make certain it happened on schedule. Our bureau called what happened at Halden Reach voluntary contribution. It did not know that under Concord contract law, a 9-year-old cannot sign anything at all, and that somewhere in the very paperwork Rel was so careful to complete correctly. That fact had been quietly, procedurally, worked around decades earlier by a clause nobody currently serving had written, and nobody currently serving had ever thought to question. Toma Ferris did not want to go into the extraction bay. He told the bureau physician this. It is in the log, timestamp recorded, because the log recorded everything. The physician noted his objection, noted that his mother's contribution waiver, signed under the 6-hour notice, under threat of a fine his family could not have paid, under a clause buried on page 191 of the Accord that authorized a guardian proxy consent during a declared adaptive necessity event, legally covered him regardless. The extraction was, by Bureau standard, routine marrow sampling, accelerated cold stress response induction, to measure the sealing of the adaptation under controlled conditions. Had been performed without incident on adults across 3 prior sampling operations. The Bureau's medical staff had performed variations of it 91 times across the Concord's history without a single fatality serious enough to trigger a mandatory review. Toma's small body did not tolerate the accelerated induction the way an adult's had. The complications began. On the 3rd day, he died on the 5th, in a medical bay 11 light years from anyone who would have recognized his name, with a physician who did in the log write the word unforeseen, a word that would later become the single most expensive word in the Cognizance Bureau's 190-year history. He was 9 years old. He had drawn 41 imaginary planets on his bedroom wall before the transports arrived. And he had named every single one of them except the last 3, and his sister Juno, 16, had promised him she would help him finish naming them when he got back. She never got the chance, but she kept the wall. Juno Ferris was in the room when the extraction team came for her brother. She was not the subject that day. She had already contributed a marrow sample on day 2, an adult threshold procedure. she had tolerated without incident, but the 6-hour notice had listed no provision for keeping siblings apart. No one on the extraction team had thought to ask Wex whether a 16-year-old should be present when her 9-year-old brother was told to lie down on an examination table in a room that smelled like antiseptic and cold metal. She remembered afterward that Toma had asked her, quietly, while a technician prepared the induction equipment, whether it was going to hurt. She had told him no because she did not know, and because it seemed like the only thing worth saying to a 9-year-old in that moment, whether or not it turned out to be true. She remembered that he had believed her because he was 9, and because she was his sister, and because neither of those facts should ever have been asked to carry the weight the Cognizance Bureau's paperwork had quietly placed on them. She did not tell anyone what she remembered from that room for a long time. Not her mother, not the Bureau's own grief counselor, who visited Halden Reach once briefly, 11 days after the transports departed, and asked careful, practiced questions that Juno answered as briefly as she could, because she had already understood, at 16, that the counselor's job was to close the file gently, not to reopen it. She told Ellen Faraday, eventually, in year 5, in a conversation that took place at the same kitchen table, where she had finished naming her brother's 41 planets. For it was the first time she had said any of it aloud. Ellen did not record it that day. She simply listened, the way she had learned to listen across 4 years of kitchen tables that were not her own. And asked, at the end, only one question: whether Juno would ever be willing to say any of it to people who had never met either of them. In a room that would decide whether it mattered. Juno had said she needed to think about it. She thought about it for 11 months. Their mother, Sella Ferris, signed the release form that returned Toma's body to Halden Reach 9 days later. The form required a signature acknowledging receipt of remains and closing the incident file. She signed it in the same handwriting she had used to sign the proxy consent 6 weeks earlier, because grief, it turns out, does not change a person's signature, only what that signature is asked to mean. What none of them knew, not Toma, not his mother, not the physician who wrote "unforeseen" and closed the file, was that a routine sampling log from a Bureau facility 6 systems away had, 4 months earlier, already been copied onto a data crystal, small enough to fit inside a hollowed-out data pin, and carried out through a service corridor by someone who had spent 19 years inside the Bureau, learning exactly how thoroughly it documented its own conscience. That copy would not surface for a long time yet, but it was already moving, and it was not the only one. Overseer Malric Dess stood on the observation deck of his lead transport, watching the extraction teams move across Halden Reach's central square. Anne thought, not for the first time, that the settlement looked exactly like every other pre-contribution colony he had ever secured. Small prefabricated homes with frost on the windows. A community hall with a hand-painted sign, children's boots, dozens of pairs, lined up outside a school building because someone, evidently, had a rule about tracking ice indoors. He did not read the rule as significant. He read it as texture, the kind of local detail his mission briefings always included and his operational reports never mentioned, because it had no bearing on the schedule. The schedule was 9 days. Day 1, arrival, notice, compliance verification, initial medical intake. Day 2 through 7, processing in staggered cohorts of no more than 12 subjects at a time, per the Bureau's own welfare guidelines, which Dess followed exactly. because he had built his career on the conviction that following guidelines was what separated a lawful operation from an atrocity. By day 8, final review day 9, departure, he had run this schedule 10 times. He expected to run it a great many more. A Halden Reach town councillor, an older man named Priet, approached him on the second day and asked, in the flat, controlled voice of someone rationing his own anger, because he had already worked out that anger would not help him. Whether there was any process by which the colony could contribute fewer subjects, or older ones only, given how young some of the listed names were. The sampling target was calculated by bureau geneticists based on statistical need, Des told him. I don't set the target, I execute it. If you have a formal objection, the Accord provides a channel for filing one after the operation concludes. After, that is the procedure. Yes, Priya did not say anything else. He walked back toward the community hall, past the line of children's boots, and Des watched him go and felt, for perhaps 4 seconds, something that might have been the beginning of a doubt, before the next status update arrived on his console, and the feeling passed the way most things passed on a schedule this tight. He did not attend the extraction procedures personally. That was not his role. His role was perimeter security and transport logistics, and he performed it on Halden Reach as everywhere else, without incident, without deviation, and without ever once standing in the room where a 9-year-old boy asked a bureau physician if he could go home after. Commander Ellen Faraday learned about Halden Reach 9 days after the transports lifted off, through a routine casualty notice buried in a data packet she almost didn't open. She had 11 other packets queued that morning, most of them trade schedule paperwork, and the casualty notice sat third from the top with a subject line so administratively bland: adaptive necessity event, a human contribution, fatality update, that a less careful reader would have filed it without a second look. She had not always been a diplomat. She had spent her first 11 working years as a field medic with the Human Relief Corps, the kind of job that taught you to triage a disaster before anyone told you it was one. And it was this training, not her later diplomatic credentials, that made her read the casualty notice twice, then a third time, then pull the full sampling authorization it referenced. Halden Reach Vitality Accord Section 191A, Guardian Proxy Consent, 6 subjects under legal majority. 1 fatality, subject age 9, cause unforeseen physiological response to Protocol 9 induction. As she did not sleep that night, she filed a formal review request the next morning. The response, when it came 11 days later, was not unkind. It was in its way worse than unkind. It was correct. Your request has been logged. How? The Life Sciences Oversight Committee's next standing session is scheduled in 19 weeks. Emergency sessions require sponsorship from a full voting member of the committee. A human delegation status, non-voting observer capacity. Recommend resubmission through appropriate channel. She went to the appropriate channel. The appropriate channel, it turned out, had 5 separate doors before it, each one polite, each one correct, each one a small closed hand against the same urgency. The first door was the Concord's General Registrar's office, which informed her that casualty notices involving Accord-authorized operations were not eligible for independent review unless a signatory species formally objected. Humanity, having signed the Accord at admission, was itself the signatory species in question, and could not object to its own signature. The second door was the Office of Interspecies Grievance, which informed her that grievance filings required the affected individual, or their direct legal guardian, to submit in person, and that Seela Ferris, still 11 light-years away on an ice moon burying her son, had not been informed that this option existed, because no one at the Bureau was obligated to tell her. The third door was a Concord ombudsman with a reputation among junior delegates for genuine sympathy, who told Ellen off the record that she personally thought the Guardian proxy clause was outdated and cruel. And that she had said so in 3 separate internal memos over the past decade, and that nothing had come of any of them. And that she was sorry, and that she hoped Ellen understood. This was not the same as not caring. Ellen understood. She understood it was exactly the same as not caring, in every way that mattered to a 9-year-old boy. And she did not say so, because she had already begun to suspect that the version of herself who said such things out loud, in these rooms to these people, was going to lose. The fourth door was technically a person rather than an office. A junior Concord magistrate named Halvor Wren, assigned to preliminary review of cross-species grievances, who spent 40 minutes with Ellen listening carefully, taking notes and nodding at all the right moments, before informing her that his authority extended only to grievances under 50,000 Concord standard credits in claimed damages. And that a wrongful death matter involving an Accord-authorized operation exceeded his jurisdiction by definition, regardless of the sum actually being claimed, because no sum had been claimed at all. Ellen pointed out that she was not seeking damages. Magistrate Wren agreed that this made the matter worse. Jurisdictionally speaking, not better, since his office had no category for a grievance that wanted accountability instead of money. He was, she thought afterward, probably the most genuinely sympathetic person she met in 5 doors. And it had made no difference whatsoever. Fifth door said, in a different vocabulary, the same 2 things every door before it had said. This is not my authority, and try the next one. The 6th door was Director Cassia Reel. Reel received her, on schedule 11 days after that, in an office, 3 floors above the Bureau's central archive, in a meeting that lasted exactly the 22 minutes her calendar had allotted. I want to be direct with you, Commander, Reel said, and her voice was calm the way a filed report is calm. The operation at Halden Reach was conducted in full compliance with Section 191 SE. The proxy consent was valid. The fatality was reviewed by our internal medical board and classified as an unforeseeable outlier. I understand. This is difficult to hear. I do not think it makes it untrue. He was 9 years old. Ellen said, I'm aware, you're aware, Commander. I read every incident report that crosses this desk. I remember every name. Reel did not look away when she said it, and that, more than anything else, was what convinced Ellen that Reel believed it. That is not the same as having the authority to reopen a compliant operation retroactively. If you believe the Accord's proxy consent provision is wrong, the correct path is legislative reform. Submitted through your committee seat, which, as you know, you do not currently hold. Then how does a species that doesn't hold that seat ever get the provision changed? Reel considered the question with what looked, for a moment, like genuine effort. Patience, she said finally. Precedent decades, usually. I did not write the process. Commander, I inherited it, the way you will one day hand it to whoever replaces you. There won't be a decade for the next Toma Ferris. No, Reel said, and for one unguarded second, something crossed her face that was not quite regret. Because Reel did not yet believe she had anything to regret, but was perhaps its distant, uncomfortable cousin. There won't be. I am sorry for that. I don't have the authority to make it not true. The card. It was the third time in 11 days someone had told Ellen politely that the door she needed was on the other side of a wall she had no key to. As she thanked Director Reel for her time, she did not mean it, and she suspected Reel knew she didn't. And neither of them said so, because that too was a kind of correctness the system had trained them both to perform. She did not know it yet, walking out of that office, but she was never going to ask the Bureau for anything again. How? She also did not know, walking out of that office, that in 4 months a woman she had never met was going to risk everything she had spent 19 years building for a reason that had nothing to do with Ellen at all, and that when the two of them finally sat down together, a case that ended the Bureau's guardian proxy clause would already be half built before Ellen understood it existed. What happened over the next 6 years did not look from the outside like resistance. It looked like an unremarkable human liaison officer doing an unremarkable liaison officer's job, attending trade sessions, filing routine paperwork, cultivating quiet, ordinary friendships with delegates from smaller member species who had spent decades being polite to a Concord that had never once been curious about them in return. But 6 years is a long time to be patient, and Ellen Faraday had spent 11 of her working years learning that the difference between a disaster and a catastrophe was almost always the quality of the preparation nobody saw. She began with the archive, not the Bureau's. She had no access to that, but the Concord's own procedural record, public in theory, buried in practice under 400,000 hours of session transcripts that almost no one had ever bothered to search. She found in year 1 a precedent that would matter more than she understood at the time. A sealed case file from a distant sector, filed 9 years earlier, concerning a single unarmed vessel and a species called human that had, in a completely unrelated conflict with an entirely different power, forced a 231-year-old military doctrine into retreat without firing a shot in anger. The case had entered Concord law under an obscure cross-jurisdictional recognition clause, has a citable precedent for what it called demonstrated capacity for restraint under existential threat. Its closing line, quoted directly in the filing, had been, "Adaptation is not surrender." Ellen read it 17 times. She did not fully understand yet how she would use it. But she copied it to a she had already begun to think of, privately, as the case. And she kept building. In year 2 she found Dr. Sael Voren, or, more precisely, Dr. Sael Voren found her. Voren was Austrian, the same methodical, long-lived species that staffed most of the Bureau's senior posts, including Rails. She had worked inside the Cognizance Bureau for 19 years as a genomic ethics reviewer, a position whose entire purpose, on paper, was to catch exactly the kind of harm that had killed Toma Ferris before it happened. She had flagged Protocol 9's pediatric risk profile in an internal memo 4 years before Holden Reach. The memo had been read, acknowledged, and filed under pending further data. She had spent every year since watching the pending data arrive, one casualty report at a time, and doing nothing, because doing something had always seemed, until Holden Reach, like a door that would only close on her without opening anywhere else. Ellen did not recruit her. Voren came to her, in year 2, in a public transit corridor on a station neither of them had any professional reason to be on, and said 11 words that Ellen would remember for the rest of her life. "I have been documenting this for a very long time." Voren did not hand over anything that day. She was, Ellen would learn, a careful person, methodical to the point of appearing cold, and the first 3 meetings between them consisted almost entirely of Voren asking questions and Ellen answering them. Because Voren needed, before she risked her career and very possibly her freedom, to be certain that the human liaison officer sitting across from her would not simply use whatever evidence she provided for a single loud news cycle and then move on to the next crisis. "Hi. You want to know if I'll actually finish this," Ellen said at their 4th meeting. "Yes, I buried a 9-year-old's file in my head 2 years ago, and I have not stopped thinking about it since. I don't know how to prove patience to you except by being patient. Ask me again next year." Voren asked her again next year, and the year after that, what Voren had, by the time she finally began transferring documents, was not a weapon. It was worse for the Bureau than any weapon could have been. It was proof, logs, memos, internal reviews, casualty classifications, all of it stamped, dated, and signed by Bureau officials who had believed correctly that no one outside the Bureau would ever read it. Real's own signature appeared on 41 of the documents, and not because Real had wanted anyone hurt, because Real had done exactly what her job required. Her job, faithfully executed for 40 years, had produced this. Ellen understood something then that she would carry into every session of the negotiations still to come. The Bureau was not a monster hiding evidence. It was a machine, meticulously honest about its own conduct, that had simply never expected anyone to ask it the right question. She spent the next 4 years asking. The work was slow in a way that resisted narrative. There were months where nothing happened except Voren smuggling a single memo through a courier network built from favors and old friendships, one document at a time, hidden inside routine data transfers that a Bureau audit would have had to search deliberately, specifically, and at length to notice. An audit no one had any reason to order, because nothing about a human liaison officer's public schedule looked like a threat to anyone. There were months where Ellen did nothing but travel, quietly, to distant sectors of human space, sitting across kitchen tables from families whose relatives had contributed to sampling operations over the preceding decade, asking permission to record what they remembered, promising nothing except that someone would finally be listening. She was told, no at first, more often than yes, grief does not always want to be filed as evidence. Hammond, some families had already made an uneasy peace with the Accord's version of events, and did not thank her for reopening it. She did not push, she left contact information. Some of them called back, months later, when the ache of being disbelieved by their own memory of the day finally outweighed the fear of being disbelieved by a Concord tribunal. By year 4, she had testimonies from 6 different species, not only humans, because Voren's documents made plain, in a detail that would matter enormously later, that Halden Reach was not the Bureau's first pediatric casualty, not its first cold adaptation sampling operation, and not even the operation with the worst outcome on record. Permanent. It was simply the first one a liaison officer with a medic's instincts had happened to read carefully. Some of the testimony gathering nearly cost Ellen everything. In year 3, a courier carrying a partial data transfer for Voren was stopped for a routine transit inspection, 2 jumps short of her destination, and stood in a Bureau security checkpoint for 11 minutes while an officer scanned a cargo manifest that, had it been searched 1 layer deeper, would have ended the entire 6-year effort before it had a chance to matter. The officer did not search deeper. He was tired, and the shift was long, and the manifest looked, on its surface, exactly as boring as it was designed to look. Aha, Voren did not learn how close that courier had come to discovery until 8 months later, and when she did not sleep for 2 days. Ellen did not know at the time how close it had come either. She learned it the same way months later in a debrief that made her sit very still in her office chair for a long time afterward, thinking about how much of what mattered in the world turned, in the end, on a tired officer's decision not to look one layer deeper. Han. There was a night in year 4 that Ellen would never describe in any official report, because it belonged to no procedure and cited no precedent. She had just returned from a testimony-gathering trip to a distant human colony where a mother had, for the 3rd time in as many attempts, closed the door on her before she could finish explaining why she was asking. Ellen sat alone in her quarters that night with the case file open on her desk. 311 testimonies by then, thick enough to feel, absurdly, like it should already be enough, and thought, with a clarity that frightened her more than any door ever had, that she might spend the rest of her career building something that never left this room. She called Voren that night, which she almost never did outside their scheduled meetings, because the habit of caution had become, by then, closer to instinct than discipline. I don't know if this works, she said when Voren answered. I don't know if 200 testimonies or 400 testimonies changes anything. If the assembly can just move it behind a closed door the way it's moved everything else. There was a long pause on Voren's end. I flagged Protocol 9 4 years before Halden Reach, she said finally. One memo, it went nowhere because one memo was easy to file and forget. I don't know that 400 testimonies will be easy to file and forget. That is the entire wager we are making. I don't have a better one to offer you. That's not very reassuring. No, Voren agreed. It isn't. I am not in the business of reassurance, Commander. I am in the business of documentation. I have found, across 19 years, that documentation is the only thing I have ever been able to offer that eventually, somewhere, someone could not simply explain away. Ellen did not sleep well that night either, but she opened the case file again in the morning. And she kept building because the alternative, closing it, going home, letting the door stay shut, was not, she had already discovered 2 years earlier, in Riel's office, a version of herself she was willing to become. By year 6, the case contained 372 individual testimonies from 6 different species, cross-referenced against Voren's internal documentation and 11 separate sampling operations. It named names, it named dates, it named children. It was not, Ellen knew, going to be enough on its own. A case, however airtight, presented to a subcommittee that would not seat her, filed through a channel that had already told her 3 times to go elsewhere. I would die exactly the way her first request had died, quietly, correctly, on schedule. She needed a floor, not a subcommittee, the full assembly, all 19 species, under the glass dome of the Halborn Rotunda, where the Bureau could not simply decline to hear her. There was, buried in Concord procedural law, a mechanism for that. It was 219 years old, had been invoked 4 times in Concord history, and required something almost no delegate ever managed to produce. A petition co-sponsored by representatives of at least 3 member species, presenting evidence of a systemic breach rather than an isolated incident, sufficient to justify bypassing standing committee review entirely. Ellen had by year 6 sponsors from 4 species. One of them was Ostren, a retired bureau administrator named Ovek San, Voren's own former mentor, who had spent 30 years believing his life's work was decent and had not slept properly since the day Voren showed him otherwise. He signed the petition with a hand that Ellen noticed and never mentioned was shaking slightly. Heart. I trained half the people who ran those operations, he told her the night before he signed. Heart. I told them thoroughness was the same thing as conscience. I believed it. I need you to understand that I believed it, and that believing it did not make it true. And that I am signing this because I would rather be the man who admitted that too late than the man who never admitted it at all. Juno Ferris signed the petition too, as a named testifying witness the week before it was filed. She was 22 by then, no longer the girl who had sat frozen at a kitchen table, unable to say what she remembered. Ellen asked her, one final time, whether she wanted to withdraw her name. Testifying publicly meant her brother's death would become part of the permanent Concord record. Discussed by delegates who had never known him, cited in filings for decades after everyone who remembered his voice was gone. I don't want him to be a citation, Juno said, but I want him to be a citation more than I want him to be nothing. He was nothing to the Bureau. For 6 years, I'm done letting that be the only record that exists. Apache filed the petition on a Thursday. It was accepted the following Monday. Sale Voren resigned from the Cognizance Bureau that same week, effective immediately, and did not tell Director Reel why until the day of the hearing, because by then it no longer mattered whether Reel was warned. The emergency session convened under the Halborn Rotunda's glass dome 19 days later had, with all 19 member species present, 41 voting delegates seated in the tiered gallery that had, for 268 years, decided what the Concord considered acceptable. Cassia Reel sat in the respondent's chair, with the same composure she brought to every session of her 40-year career. She had reviewed the petition. She believed, and would say so plainly when asked, that the Bureau's conduct at Halden Reach and in 10 other operations had been fully compliant with the Vitality Accord as written. If the Assembly wished to change the Accord, that was the Assembly's prerogative. It was not, in her view, evidence of wrongdoing that a law faithfully followed had produced an outcome the Assembly now found difficult to look at. Overseer Malric Dess, who commanded the Bureau's Enforcement Division and had signed the transport orders for 11 separate sampling operations, including Halden Reach, sat beside her and did not intend to say much at all. Legality was his argument. He had never needed a second one, and he did not expect to need one today. Ellen Faraday stood at the petitioner's podium with 372 testimonies compressed into a single presentation she had rehearsed, alone in an empty conference room 40 times. She did not open with anger. She had learned, across 6 years of watching the Concord's machinery, that anger read as exactly the kind of emotional decision-making the Concord had always assumed humanity was prone to. She opened instead with the Accord itself. Section 191, read aloud, in full the way the Accord itself required consent language to be read aloud to every contributing colonist. She let the delegates hear, in the Bureau's own legal voice, the clause that had authorized a guardian to sign away a 9-year-old's body on his behalf. I am not here to argue that Director Reel broke the law, she said. I am here to argue that the law was broken before she ever touched it. That a signature obtained under 6 hours' notice, under financial threat, on behalf of a child who told a Bureau physician directly that he did not consent, that this was never, under any honest reading of the word, voluntary. The Bureau's own physician wrote that objection into the record. I would like the assembly to hear it. She played it. 21 seconds of audio, a boy's voice. Thin and certain. I don't want to. Can I go home after? No one in the rotunda spoke for a long moment. But that recording alone, Ellen knew, would not be enough. A single tragedy could still be filed as an outlier, the way Reel's board had filed it. High. What the assembly needed was the pattern, and the pattern was the part of the case she had built for 6 years, and had not yet shown anyone outside her own small circle. She called Dr. Sale Voren to the floor. Voren's testimony took 40 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. She simply read, in order, dates and memos, and her own 4-year-old warning about Protocol 9's pediatric risk. Hard, and watched several delegates who had known her professionally for decades sit very still as they understood in real time what she had spent 19 years quietly documenting and 9 years quietly grieving that no one had asked her about. Harmont, I want the assembly to understand something, Voren said, near the end. I did not do this because I stopped believing in the Bureau's mission. Ahad. I did this because I never stopped believing in it, and I could no longer pretend the Bureau I worked for still believed in it either. Reel's junior counsel objected twice correctly on procedural grounds. Both objections were sustained. Neither slowed the room down. A delegate from a species called the Vantric, old ally of the Bureau's parent ministry, rose to press Voren on cross-examination, asked, not unreasonably, whether a disgruntled former employee's testimony could be trusted at all. Hoven that she had left the Bureau, under circumstances the Assembly had not yet fully reviewed. I left the Bureau 19 days ago, by my own choice, because I finally had somewhere to bring what I knew, Voren answered. Ask your own auditors to verify every document I have submitted against the Bureau's internal archive. I have not altered a single record. I do not need you to trust me. I need you to trust the Bureau's own paperwork, because I did not write most of it. Director Reel's staff did. The Vantric delegate had no response to that. He sat down. Then Ellen called her final witness, and this was the moment she had built the entire case around, a moment that could not be filed under pending further data or unforeseeable outlier. Pause, it did not come from a report. It came from a person. Juno Ferris was 16 years old. She had never spoken in front of anyone more important than her school's disciplinary board. She stood at the podium in the Halborn Rotunda, in front of 41 delegates from 19 species who had never once, in 14 years, had a reason to learn a single human child's name, and she said, my brother's name was Toma. He was 9. He drew 41 planets on his bedroom wall, and he asked me to help him name the last few. I never got to, because your Bureau decided his body belonged to a treaty he never read and never signed. Heart. She paused. Ellen had told her she did not need to say anything else. Juno had disagreed. You call it a voluntary contribution, she said. He asked if he could go home after. That's in your own file. I've read it 40 times. I want to know what word you'd use for a 9-year-old asking to go home. If not the true one. No one answered her. For 11 full seconds, according to the official transcript, no one in the rotunda said anything at all. But this, too, was not yet the ending. What came next was procedure, the part of the story that no dramatization ever wants to sit inside, the part that actually decided it. Director Reel requested, as she was entitled to, that the session move to closed deliberation before any vote, citing the sensitivity of ongoing Bureau operations across the Concord. It was, on its face, a reasonable request. It was also, Ellen knew, exactly the mechanism by which every prior attempt to review the Bureau had quietly died, moved behind closed doors. a negotiated down filed forgotten. Voren had told her in year 4 that this was precisely how the Bureau had absorbed 3 previous internal review attempts in its history, none of which had ever reached the public record at all. Lied. This was the moment 6 years of preparation had been built to meet. Ellen, invoked by name and citation number, the 219-year-old procedural clause her petition had been filed under. The same clause that had let her bypass the subcommittee in the first place. High, and which explicitly barred closed deliberation on any petition alleging a systemic breach once full testimony had been entered into the open record. She had read that clause more times than she had read anything else in her life. She had built her entire 6-year strategy around the exact sentence Real was at this moment about to be denied. Real's counsel argued, briefly, that the clause applied only to petitions where all named respondents had been given adequate opportunity to prepare a defense, and suggested that the scope of Voren's late-arriving documentation exceeded what the Bureau could reasonably be expected to review on short notice. It was a good argument. It was also Ellen had anticipated it exactly, which was why she had filed a formal notice of intent 11 weeks earlier, by giving the Bureau far more preparation time than the clause technically required, specifically so that this objection could not hold. Hardy, the Assembly's presiding delegate, an elder of a species that had sat on the Concord's founding council 268 years earlier, checked the citation herself, allowed for the record, cross-referencing Ellen's original filing date against the clause's notice requirement. The notice requirement was met with 11 weeks to spare, the presiding delegate said. The request for closed deliberation is denied. The vote will proceed in open session. Real did not react visibly. She had built her entire career on not reacting visibly. Something in the set of her shoulders told the delegates nearest her that she understood, in that instant, precisely what 6 years of an unarmed liaison officer's patience had done to her. Overseer Dess rose once, briefly, to state for the record that every sampling operation under his command had been conducted with full documented compliance. And that he did not believe compliance with the law the Assembly itself had written should now be treated as an offense. It was, in its narrow legal sense, not an unreasonable point, and 2 delegates nodded slightly as he made it. Ellen let the silence after his statement sit for a moment before she answered it. You're right that you followed the law, she said. That's not a defense. That's the whole reason we're here. The law was wrong, and it took a 9-year-old's death for anyone with the standing to say so out loud. Cassia Real sat through the final minutes before the vote with her hands folded in front of her, a posture she had used in every difficult session of her 40-year career, and thought, with an unfamiliar and unwelcome precision, about the 41 documents bearing her own signature that Voren had entered into the record. She had signed each of them believing she was doing her job correctly. She still believed, in the narrow legal sense, that this was true. What she had not accounted for, in 40 years of believing it, was that a room full of delegates could look at a signature obtained correctly, on a form completed correctly, authorizing a procedure performed correctly, and conclude that correctness itself had been the failure all along. She thought briefly of the physician who had written "unforeseen" in Toma Ferris's file. She had reviewed that entry herself at the time and approved its classification. She had not thought of the boy's name again until Juno Ferris said it aloud from the podium. She thought of it now, and she found that she could not stop. a delegate from a small member species called the Ilvain, who had joined the Concord only 6 years before humanity, and had never once, in that time, been asked to speak on a matter of this weight, rose before the vote, and asked to be recognized. "I have sat in this chamber for 20 years, the Ilvain delegate said, and I have watched species like mine and species like the humans learn the same lesson, which is that the Concord's patience is reserved for those already inside it, and its caution is reserved for those still trying to get in. I do not know if this vote changes that I would like it today to at least admit that it is true." Hard. No formal motion followed his statement. None was required, but 3 delegates who had not yet declared a position were seen, by more than one observer in the gallery, to glance briefly at one another before the vote began. The small, wordless calculation of people who had just heard something they could not easily file away. The vote took 11 minutes. It was not unanimous. One delegate abstained, citing standing trade obligations with the Bureau's parent ministry that she said she could not, in good conscience, immediately sever. But of the remaining 40 votes, 39 found in favor of the petition. 39-1, the Vitality Accord's Guardian Proxy Consent Clause was suspended, effective immediately, pending full legislative review. Every active Cognizance Bureau sampling operation was ordered to cease within 72 hours. Independent Concord auditors, drawn from species with no institutional relationship to the Bureau, would review all 190 years of its operational record. Director Cassia Rail was not removed by the vote. That was not what the vote had been for. But she resigned her post 6 weeks later, in a 2-paragraph letter that Ellen read once and never spoke of publicly, in which Reel wrote that she had spent 40 years believing thoroughness was the same thing as conscience, and that she no longer believed this, and that she did not expect the distinction to matter to anyone she had harmed, and that she understood why it should not. Overseer Dess did not resign. He was formally reprimanded by the independent auditors 8 months later, and reassigned to a logistics posting with no enforcement authority, where, according to the one colleague who kept in occasional contact with him, he still kept a copy of Section 191 on his desk, though no one who knew him could say for certain whether he kept it as a reminder of what he had believed, or of what he had been wrong to. The independent audit itself took 2 years to complete. Its final report ran to 9,000 pages and confirmed what Voren's smuggled documents had already suggested, that the Cognizance Bureau's Guardian Proxy Clause had been invoked. Over its 190-year history, against members of 11 different species, and that at least 91 contributions across that span had resulted in a fatality, the Bureau's internal review process had classified every single time as an unforeseeable outlier. The 91 unforeseeable outliers, the presiding delegate noted dryly when the report was formally entered into the Concord record, was not a description of an outlier. It was a description of a pattern the Bureau had simply never been asked to name. Reparations, when the Assembly finally authorized them the following year, were modest by any measure that could undo what had happened. Ellen said so publicly more than once to reporters who wanted her to call the outcome a triumph. Families of confirmed casualties received a formal acknowledgement entered into the permanent Concord record, not an apology. Precisely, since Concord institutional law had no clean mechanism for one, but the closest structural equivalent it possessed, a standing resolution naming each of the 91 dead individually, read aloud once a year in the Halborn Rotunda on the anniversary of the vote. Marcella Ferris travels to the Rotunda for that reading every year she is able. She has never once missed her son's name. Halden Reach held its memorial 8 months after the vote, on the same ice field where the transports had once landed. It was not a large ceremony. 340 of the settlement's original 341 residents attended, along with a handful of returned contributors from other sampling operations who had heard about Toma Ferris and travelled a long way to stand in a place they had never seen for a boy they had never met. There is a wall in the Ferris family home with 41 hand-drawn planets on it, and nobody has painted over it. June Ferris finished naming the last 3 the week after the vote. Permanent, alone at the kitchen table, because it was the only part of her promise to her brother that anyone, even a Concord assembly, could not take a vote on. Ellen Faraday spoke at the memorial. She did not read from a prepared statement. She said the same 3 words she had said at the close of her testimony to the assembly, and she said them again at the memorial. And Juno Ferris, 17 now, and already at the Concord's invitation, training for a junior liaison post of her own, would say them a 3rd time, 5 years later, at the opening of the Concord's first permanent life sciences oversight seat ever held by a human delegate. Consent cannot be signed for the silent. Consent cannot be signed for the silent. Consent cannot be signed for the silent. The ice field at Halden Reach still has a small marker where the transports once stood, planted the year after the memorial, low and plain, engraved with one boy's name and the names of 41 planets that exist nowhere except a bedroom wall, and the memory of the people who loved him. Every year on the anniversary, the settlement school, 19 students, then 26 now, walks out to the marker together. The way a small town keeps a promise it has decided not to let time erase. The Cognizance Bureau still exists. The Concord did not abolish it. The Assembly's vote had never asked for that. And Ellen, when a reporter later asked her whether she regretted not pushing for its dissolution, Law said only that a machine that had finally been forced to look at what it built could still, sometimes, be made to build something better. A bureau operates today under full life sciences oversight, a seat humanity now holds permanently. The first new species to gain that seat in over a century, filled first by Ellen Faraday and, 5 years after her, by Juno Ferris. 372 testimonies did not undo what happened to Toma Ferris, or to the 91 other confirmed casualties later documented across the Bureau's full 190-year record. Nothing filed in the Halden Rotunda could undo any of that, and no one who worked on the case ever pretended otherwise. Sail Voren, in a rare public interview 2 years after the vote, said that she did not think of the case as a victory. She thought of it as an overdue correction to a debt that could never actually be repaid, only stopped from growing larger. Paschal. She returned to the Bureau 18 months after her resignation, not as an ethics reviewer this time, but as one of the independent auditors, reviewing the very operations she had once been powerless to stop, a position she said she had accepted, because someone who understood exactly how the old system had hidden things from itself was the only kind of auditor likely to know where to look. Hovik San, the retired administrator whose signature had helped Ellen bypass the subcommittee, I did not live to see the final audit completed. He died the following winter, quietly at home, and Ellen travelled to attend the small gathering held in his memory, where a former colleague read aloud, at San's own request left in writing beforehand, the same line Ellen had built her entire case around. Adaptation is not surrender. He had asked that it be read. He'd written, because he wanted the last thing said about him to be an admission that changing your mind, however late, was not the same thing as failing to have had one worth changing. But the next adaptive necessity event the Concorde declared 4 years later was met not with silent transports and 6-hour notices, but with a mandatory independent review, a right to refusal for every individual regardless of age, and a standing committee seat for every species the Bureau's authority touched. And not because of a fleet, not because of a weapon, not because of a threat loud enough to frighten an empire into compliance, but because a field medic with no vote and no seat and no weapon spent 6 years asking the same patient question of everyone who would listen, until enough of them finally did. The consent cannot be signed for the silent. It never could be. It had simply taken a very long time, and one very stubborn liaison officer, and a woman inside the very institution she was fighting, willing to risk everything her career had built, for the Concorde to finally admit it. This is a work of fiction. Halden Reach, the Solène Concorde, and every character and organization named in this story are invented for this series, and do not depict any real event, a government or population. That's the story of Halden Reach, and of the vote that finally made someone else's paperwork answer for a boy who only ever asked to go home. If you were sitting in Ellen Faraday's seat on day 1, no vote, no committee, no fleet behind you, would you have spent 6 years building a case, a hall, or gone straight to the assembly and risked losing everything on the first try? Tell me which one in the comments. If you want to know what happens when Juno Ferris takes that oversight seat for herself 5 years later, and what she finds waiting in the Bureau's sealed pre-Concorde archives, subscribe, because that's exactly where episode 11 picks up. And if this is your first time here, go back and watch episode 9, Adaptation is Not Surrender. The case Ellen cites in her own testimony is real inside this series. And it's the reason the Assembly even had a precedent to listen to.